Welcome, weary traveller, to this quiet corner of history. Before we begin our journey into the harsh realities of peasant life in feudal Europe, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply unwinding with some historical storytelling, I'm grateful you've chosen to join me. Picture yourself awakening not to an alarm clock, but to the tolling of church bells echoing across a landscape shrouded in morning mist. You open your eyes in a world where survival itself is a daily victory, where the simple act of filling your belly requires back-breaking labour, and where comfort is a luxury reserved for the very few. This is feudal Europe, and you are not a noble lord dwelling in a stone castle. You are not a merchant counting coins in a bustling market square. You are a peasant, a serf bound to the land, and your life is about to reveal itself as a relentless struggle against hunger, disease, exploitation, and the cruel whims of both nature and nobility. The year could be 1200, perhaps 1300, maybe 1400. The exact date matters little, for the grinding hardships of peasant existence remained remarkably consistent across these centuries. What matters is that you have awakened into a world that would test every fibre of your being, every day, until your final breath. Your dwelling is not a home in any sense we might recognise today. It is a single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15, shared not only with your family, but often with your livestock. The walls are wattle and daub, mud and straw smeared over a wooden frame, offering little protection from the bitter cold of winter or the stifling heat of summer. The roof is thatch, constantly in need of repair, leaking when the rains come heavy. There are no windows, only a single opening that serves as both door and primary source of light. The floor beneath your feet is nothing more than packed earth, often damp, sometimes frozen, covered with rushes that are changed infrequently and harbour fleas, lice, and the accumulated filth of daily life. Your bed is a simple straw mattress, if you can call it that. More accurately, it is a collection of straw and rags shared with your spouse and children, offering little comfort and less warmth. The straw is old, musty, and alive with insects that feast upon your blood through the long nights. But perhaps most shocking to our modern sensibilities is the company you keep. Your cow, if you are fortunate enough to own one, stands in the corner of your dwelling. Your pig roots through the rushes on your floor. Your chickens nest in the rafters above your head. This arrangement serves multiple purposes. The animals provide warmth during the bitter winter months. Their presence offers some protection from theft, and their proximity allows you to monitor their health and safety. Yet this intimate cohabitation comes at a terrible cost. The air you breathe is thick with the stench of animal waste, unwashed human bodies, smoke from your cooking fire, and the general decay that accompanies a life lived without proper sanitation. Disease spreads rapidly in such conditions, and death is always lurking just beyond your threshold. Your daily routine begins before dawn, for there is no artificial light to extend your working hours, and every moment of daylight must be utilised if you hope to survive. Your first task is often to tend to your animals, ensuring they have survived the night, feeding them what little fodder you can spare, and milking your cow if you are blessed with one. Breakfast, if it can be called that, consists of whatever meagre provisions remain from the previous day. Perhaps a crust of coarse bread, baked from barley or rye flour, mixed with whatever cheaper grains or even sawdust your local baker has used to stretch his supplies. The bread is dense, hard, and often stale, requiring considerable effort to chew and providing little in the way of nutrition or satisfaction. If you are particularly fortunate, you might have a thin porridge made from oats or barley, watered down to make it last longer. Occasionally there might be a scrap of salted pork or dried fish, but such protein is rare and precious, reserved for special occasions or times of particular need. Your drink is not water, for clean water is often difficult to obtain and frequently contaminated with the waste that flows through your village. Instead, you consume weak ale, brewed by local alewives who water down their product to increase their profits. Even children drink this weak ale, for it is safer than the alternative and provides some small measure of nutrition. After this meagre meal, you face the labour that will consume the vast majority of your waking hours. If you are a man, you likely work the fields that belong to your lord, using primitive tools that have changed little in centuries. Your plough is wooden, often pulled by an ox if the village is fortunate enough to share one, or by human labour if not. Your scythe is dull and frequently in need of repair. Your hands are permanently calloused, your back perpetually aching from the constant bending and lifting required by agricultural work. The work is back-breaking and endless. In spring, you prepare the soil and plant the crops that will hopefully sustain you through the coming year. In summer, you tend the growing plants, fighting a constant battle against weeds, pests, and disease. In autumn, you harvest what you can, knowing that a significant portion of your crop will go to your lord as rent and taxes. In winter, you repair tools, maintain what livestock you possess, and hope that your stored provisions will last until spring returns. If you are a woman, your labour is no less demanding, though it takes different forms. You are responsible for maintaining the household, such as it is. You cook the family's meals over an open fire that fills your dwelling with smoke and poses a constant risk of conflagration. You tend to the vegetable garden that provides what little variety exists in your family's diet. You care for the smaller livestock, the chickens and pigs that might mean the difference between survival and starvation. You also bear and raise children, knowing full well that many of them will not survive to adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, and accident claim the lives of the young with heartbreaking frequency. Those children who do survive begin working at an early age, for every pair of hands is needed if the family is to have any hope of meeting the demands placed upon them. Your clothing is simple, practical, and rarely clean. You own perhaps 2 sets of garments, one for work and one for special occasions such as holy days. Both are made from coarse wool or linen, scratchy against your skin and offering little protection from the elements. Your shoes, if you have them, are simple leather constructions that provide minimal comfort and wear out quickly on the rough ground you traverse daily. Personal hygiene is a luxury you cannot afford. Water must be carried from wells or streams, often contaminated and always requiring precious time and energy to obtain. Soap is expensive and rarely available. You bathe infrequently, and when you do, it is often in the same water used by your entire family. Your hair is unwashed, your teeth uncleaned, your body a host to parasites that cause constant itching and discomfort. The food you consume is monotonous, insufficient, and often dangerous. Your diet consists primarily of bread and porridge, made from whatever grains are available. Vegetables, when you can get them, are usually root vegetables like turnips and onions that can be stored through the winter. Meat is a rare luxury, perhaps enjoyed a few times a year when an animal dies, or during religious festivals when your lord feels generous. Even these simple foods are fraught with peril. Bread is often adulterated with sawdust, chalk, or other fillers to increase the baker's profit. Grain can become infected with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Preserved meats are heavily salted and often rancid. Vegetables may be spoiled or contaminated with human and animal waste used as fertilizer. The threat of famine hangs over you constantly. A failed harvest caused by drought, flood, disease, or war can mean starvation for entire communities. During these times of dearth, you might be reduced to eating grass, bark, or anything else that might provide some small amount of nutrition. Stories circulate of desperate people resorting to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of the dead to avoid joining them. Disease is your constant companion. Living in close quarters with animals and other humans, with poor sanitation and inadequate nutrition, you are vulnerable to a host of ailments. The common cold can develop into pneumonia. Small cuts can become infected and lead to death. Dysentery, typhoid, and plague sweep through communities with devastating regularity. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 of the population. Entire villages were wiped out, their inhabitants buried in mass graves or left to rot where they fell. For those who survived, the trauma was profound, leaving scars that lasted for generations. Your relationship with authority is one of complete subservience. You are bound to the land, unable to leave without your lord's permission. You owe him labour, typically 3 days a week working his fields, plus additional service during planting and harvest. You must also pay various taxes and fees, a portion of your crop, payment for the use of his mill to grind your grain, fees for permission to marry or inherit property. The Lord's word is law. He can punish you for real or imagined transgressions, demand additional labour or payment, and generally treat you as he sees fit. You have no legal recourse, no appeal to higher authority. Your life is entirely at his mercy, and mercy is not always forthcoming. The church, while offering some spiritual comfort, also places additional burdens upon you. You are required to pay tithes, typically 1/10 of your income, to support the local priest and the broader church hierarchy. You must observe numerous fast days throughout the year, abstaining from meat and other foods that are already scarce in your diet. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, these restrictions become even more severe, leaving you weak and hungry at a time when you need strength for the spring planting. Your children, if they survive infancy, face a life much like your own. Boys will work in the fields from an early age, learning the skills they will need to survive as adults. Girls will help with household tasks and learn the domestic skills necessary for managing a peasant household. Education is non-existent for your class. Literacy is the privilege of the nobility and clergy. Marriage is less about love than about survival and economic necessity. Young people marry to combine their meagre resources and share the burden of labour. Children are both a blessing and a burden. Extra hands to help with work, but also extra mouths to feed from already inadequate resources. Entertainment and leisure are rare luxuries. After working from dawn to dusk, you have little energy for recreation. Occasionally, there might be a festival or holy day that provides some respite from the daily grind. These celebrations often involve communal meals, dancing, and storytelling, offering precious moments of joy and community in lives otherwise marked by hardship and isolation. The changing seasons bring different challenges and opportunities. Spring offers hope in the form of new growth and the promise of a harvest, but it is also a time of great labour as fields must be prepared and planted. Summer brings long days of work under the blazing sun, tending crops and hoping for favourable weather. Autumn is harvest time, a period of intense labour as you race to gather your crops before winter arrives. Winter is perhaps the most challenging season. The days are short and dark, the weather cold and harsh. Food stores dwindle as the months pass, and hunger becomes a constant companion. The weak and elderly often do not survive these lean months, succumbing to cold, disease, or starvation. Your dwelling provides little protection from the elements. The fire that provides your only source of heat also fills the room with smoke, causing respiratory problems and eye irritation. Fuel for the fire is scarce and must be gathered constantly, adding to your daily burden of labour. The social hierarchy is rigid and unchanging. You are born a peasant and will die a peasant. There is no social mobility, no opportunity for advancement. Your children will inherit your status and your burdens. The idea that hard work might lead to prosperity is foreign to your world. Hard work is simply the price of survival. Violence is a constant threat. Bandits prey upon travelers and isolated farmsteads. Wars between nobles devastate the countryside, with peasant communities caught in the crossfire. Soldiers from both sides may pillage your crops, steal your livestock, and assault your family. You have no protection, save what you can provide for yourself. And that is precious little. Justice, when it exists at all, is harsh and arbitrary. Punishments for crimes, real or imagined, can include fines you cannot afford, physical mutilation, or death. The stocks and pillory in the village square are constant reminders of what awaits those who transgress against authority or social norms. Your understanding of the wider world is limited to what you can see from your village and what little news filters down from the nobility and clergy. You know little of geography, politics, or current events beyond your immediate surroundings. Your world is small, bounded by the fields you work and the village where you live. Religion provides some comfort and explanation for your suffering. The church teaches that your current hardships are temporary, that faithful endurance will be rewarded in the afterlife. This promise of eventual salvation helps you bear the unbearable, offering hope in the midst of despair. Yet even religious observance brings additional burdens. You must attend Mass regularly, despite the time this takes from your necessary labour. You must confess your sins to a priest, who may be little better educated or moral than yourself. You must pay for religious services, from baptisms to funerals, adding to your financial struggles. The medical care available to you is primitive and often dangerous. Local wise women may know some herbal remedies, but serious illness or injury often means death. Broken bones may heal improperly, leaving you permanently disabled. Childbirth is particularly dangerous for women, with many dying in labour or from subsequent infections. Your diet lacks many essential nutrients, leading to deficiency diseases. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C causes your teeth to loosen and your gums to bleed. Rickets from insufficient vitamin D leaves children with deformed bones. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency makes it difficult to function in the already limited light available to you. The tools you use for your work are crude and inefficient. Your plough barely scratches the surface of the soil. Your sickle requires enormous effort to cut grain. Your millstone, if the village has one, grinds grain slowly and imperfectly. Everything takes longer and requires more effort than it should, adding to your burden of labour. Storage of food and other goods is a constant challenge. Without proper containers or preservation methods, much of what you produce spoils before it can be consumed. Rats and other vermin consume precious stores, and you lack effective means to protect your supplies from these pests. The weather is beyond your control, but dominates your existence. A late spring can delay planting and reduce yields. Too much rain can rot crops in the field. Drought can destroy an entire harvest. Hail can strip grain from the stalk in minutes. You live at the mercy of forces you cannot understand or influence. Your relationship with your neighbours is complex. While you may cooperate during harvest time or other periods of intense labour, you also compete for limited resources. Disputes over boundaries, water rights, or grazing areas can lead to feuds that last for generations. The passage of time is marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of agricultural seasons and religious observances. You know the time of day by the position of the sun, the time of year by the tasks that must be performed. Your life follows patterns established centuries before your birth and likely to continue long after your death. Transportation is difficult and dangerous. Roads are little more than dirt tracks, muddy in wet weather and dusty when dry. You rarely travel more than a few miles from your birthplace. The wider world exists, but it might as well be on another planet for all the relevance it has to your daily existence. Your possessions are few and precious. A cooking pot, some basic tools, perhaps a wooden cup and bowl, constitute the bulk of your material wealth. These items must last for years or even decades, repaired again and again until they finally fall apart completely. The cycle of life and death is ever present. You witness the birth of children who may not survive their first year. You see friends and family members succumb to disease, accident, or simple exhaustion. You bury the dead in the churchyard and try not to think about when your own turn will come. Despite all these hardships, life continues. Children are born, crops are planted and harvested, communities endure. There are moments of joy amidst the suffering, a successful harvest, a wedding celebration, the birth of a healthy child. These bright spots help sustain you through the darkness. Your knowledge is practical and immediate. You know when to plant and when to harvest. You can predict weather patterns by observing natural signs. You understand the behavior of animals and the properties of local plants. This wisdom, passed down through generations, is your most valuable inheritance. The feudal system that governs your life is presented as natural and unchanging, ordained by God and necessary for social order. You are taught that some are born to rule and others to serve, and that questioning this arrangement is both futile and sinful. This ideology helps maintain the status quo, but offers little comfort to those who bear its weight. As we draw this exploration to a close, it becomes clear that peasant life in feudal Europe was indeed miserable by almost any measure we might apply. The combination of backbreaking labour, inadequate nutrition, poor living conditions, constant threat of disease, and complete lack of social mobility created an existence that was, for most, nasty, brutish, and short. Yet perhaps most remarkably, people endured. They found ways to survive, to maintain communities, to pass on knowledge and traditions to their children. They created art and music, told stories, and found meaning in their faith. The human spirit, it seems, can adapt to almost any circumstances, finding hope and purpose even in the darkest of times. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not only how far we have come, but also the resilience and strength of those who came before us. Their struggles and sacrifices laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today, a world where the hardships they faced daily would be considered unthinkable emergencies. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, perhaps take a moment to remember these forgotten souls who lived and died in circumstances we can barely imagine. Their story is part of our story, a reminder of both human suffering and human endurance that echoes across the centuries to reach us here in our peaceful present. Sleep well, knowing that you are the inheritor of countless generations who faced each dawn with courage, even when that dawn brought only the promise of another day of struggle. The medieval peasants stumbled through another endless day of toil, their stomach a hollow cavern echoing with hunger. Unlike the romantic tales of rustic abundance we often imagine, the reality of peasant life in feudal Europe was a relentless nightmare of scarcity, oppression, and suffering that would break even the strongest modern spirit. Picture waking before dawn in a cramped, windowless hovel shared with your livestock. The air, thick with smoke from a sputtering fire, mingles with the stench of animal waste and unwashed bodies. Your breakfast consists of thin, watery porridge made from whatever grain scraps you could afford, if you're fortunate enough to have any at all. The bread, when available, is a dense, gritty mass, often bulked with sawdust, chalk, or ground acorns by unscrupulous bakers desperate to stretch their meagre supplies. Your clothing is a single woolen tunic, worn for months without washing, crawling with lice and fleas that feast on your malnourished flesh. There are no spare garments, no concept of fashion, just the same scratchy, stinking rags until they literally disintegrate from your body. Privacy is non-existent as you share your living space with pigs, chickens, and often extended family members, all huddled together for warmth and survival. The work begins at sunrise and continues until your exhausted body can barely stand. Armed with primitive tools, little better than sharpened sticks, you toil in fields that belong to your lord, keeping only a fraction of what you produce. Your hands bleed from the rough implements, your back aches from constant bending, and your feet are perpetually cold and wet in shoes that are little more than leather scraps tied with string. Disease stalks you constantly. Without understanding of hygiene or germ theory, contamination runs rampant. The water you drink is often tainted with human and animal waste. The food you eat is frequently spoiled or adulterated. A simple cut can become infected and kill you within days. Childbirth is a death sentence for countless women, and infant mortality rates hover around 50%. Even if you survive childhood, your life expectancy barely reaches 40 years. The social hierarchy crushes you with its weight. You are bound to the land, essentially a piece of property that can be bought and sold with the estate. Your lord can demand additional labour, increase your rent, or punish you for imagined slights. Justice is arbitrary and brutal, with punishments ranging from public humiliation to execution for crimes as simple as poaching a rabbit to feed your starving family. The church, while offering some comfort through faith, also imposes additional burdens. Frequent fasting periods restrict your already limited diet. You must pay tithes from your meagre income, often leaving you with even less to survive on. Religious obligations consume time you desperately need for work or rest. Weather is your master. A failed harvest means starvation. Too much rain rots your crops. Too little withers them in the fields. Harsh winters bring the very real possibility of freezing or starving to death. There are no weather predictions, no insurance, no government assistance. You live entirely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. Your knowledge is limited to the narrow confines of your village and the tasks needed for survival. Most peasants cannot read or write, leaving them dependent on others for information about the world beyond their immediate surroundings. Scientific knowledge is virtually non-existent, replaced by superstition and folklore that often proves harmful rather than helpful. Medical care consists of bloodletting, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and prayer. Surgery is performed without anesthesia by barber surgeons using unsterilized tools. Many treatments are more likely to kill you than cure you. Pain is simply accepted as a constant companion throughout your short, brutal life. The legal system offers no protection for someone of your status. You cannot testify against nobles, your word carries no weight in disputes, and you have no recourse when wronged by your superiors. Violence from your betters is not only tolerated, but expected as a means of maintaining order. Social mobility is essentially impossible. You are born a peasant, you live as a peasant, and you die as a peasant. Your children will inherit the same bondage, the same suffering, the same hopeless existence. There is no escape, no opportunity for advancement, no possibility of changing your circumstances through effort or merit. Yet somehow, against all odds, the human spirit endures. Peasants find moments of joy in simple pleasures, a successful harvest, a child's laughter, a brief respite from pain. They form tight-knit communities, bound by shared suffering and mutual dependence. They create folk songs, tell stories, and maintain traditions that provide meaning and continuity in their harsh lives. Their resilience is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of peasant existence. Despite facing hardships that would overwhelm most modern people within days, they persist. They adapt. They survive. They pass down knowledge and wisdom to their children, ensuring the continuation of their communities despite overwhelming obstacles. The medieval peasant's life was indeed miserable by any reasonable standard, but it was also a testament to human endurance, to our species' remarkable ability to find hope and meaning, even in the darkest circumstances. Their suffering laid the foundation for the more comfortable world we inhabit today, built upon centuries of gradual progress and the accumulated struggles of countless forgotten souls who refused to surrender to despair. In understanding their misery, we gain perspective on our own challenges and appreciation for the privileges we often take for granted. The sun barely crests the horizon when you're already stirring from your restless sleep on that bed of straw and regret. Your body aches from yesterday's labour, but there's no time for self-pity. The rooster's crow echoes through the village, though honestly, you've been awake for hours anyway, because something was scurrying around in the thatch above your head all night. Probably rats. Definitely rats. You roll off your makeshift mattress, and your feet hit the dirt floor with a thud that sends a small cloud of dust into the air. The fire from last night has died to barely glowing embers, and the morning chill cuts through your thin woolen tunic like a knife through butter. But here's the thing about medieval mornings that really sets the tone for your entire miserable day. There's no coffee, no tea, no caffeinated anything to ease you into consciousness. Just the brutal, unforgiving reality of another day in paradise. Your stomach immediately reminds you that dinner last night was, shall we say, inadequate. That thin gruel and chunk of bread that could double as a building material barely qualified as a meal. But breakfast? Oh, breakfast is going to be a real treat. If you're lucky, maybe there's some leftover porridge from yesterday that's only slightly rancid. If you're unlucky, well, you'll find out soon enough. The first order of business is checking on the animals. And by animals, I mean the pig that shares your living space, because apparently medieval housing came with roommates whether you wanted them or not. Sir Oinksalot over there has been your faithful companion through thick and thin, though mostly thin. The pig serves multiple purposes. It's a garbage disposal, a source of warmth during those bone-chilling winter nights, and if things get really desperate, dinner. Though let's hope it doesn't come to that, because you've grown rather fond of the little guy. You step outside into the crisp morning air, and the first thing that hits you isn't the beauty of the sunrise or the peaceful quiet of the countryside. No, it's the smell. Sweet mother of all that's holy. The smell. It's a complex bouquet of human waste, animal dung, rotting vegetation, and what you can only hope is mud, but probably isn't. Medieval villages didn't exactly have waste management systems, so everything just sort of accumulated wherever it landed. Charming, really. The village is already stirring to life around you. You can hear the distant sound of other peasants beginning their daily routines, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, and the occasional curse word floating on the morning breeze as someone discovers their chickens have escaped again. It's like a medieval symphony, if symphonies were composed entirely of suffering and farm animals. Now here's where things get interesting in the worst possible way. You need to figure out what you're actually going to eat today. Your family's food stores are running dangerously low, which is pretty much a constant state of affairs. And winter is approaching faster than you'd like. The local lord took his share of your crops as rent. The church demanded its tithe, and what's left barely sustains you through the good months, let alone the lean ones ahead. You make your way to the small plot of land behind your hovel, where you attempt to grow vegetables. The key word here is attempt, because medieval agriculture was less science and more prayer-based wishful thinking. You've got some turnips that look like they've seen better days, a few scraggly onions that might be edible if you're not too picky about flavour, and some cabbage that's engaged in an ongoing battle with various insects. The insects appear to be winning. But wait, there's more excitement in store for you today. You remember that you owe 3 days of labour to your lord this week. So not only do you need to tend to your own pathetic crops and somehow find enough food to keep your family from starving, but you also get to spend half your week working someone else's land for free. It's like having a job where your boss doesn't pay you and also takes most of what you produce on your own time. Medieval capitalism at its finest. The work ahead of you today involves harvesting the Lord's grain fields. This means bent over in the hot sun, cutting wheat with a sickle that's about as sharp as a butter knife, while your back screams in protest and your hands develop blisters on top of yesterday's blisters. The overseer will be there, of course, making sure you're working hard enough and not sneaking any grain into your own pockets, because heaven forbid you should benefit from your own labour. As you prepare for this delightful day ahead, you can't help but think about the manor house visible in the distance. Up there, the Lord and his family are probably just waking up in their comfortable beds, looking forward to a breakfast that includes actual meat, fresh bread, and maybe even some exotic spices. They'll spend their day making decisions about other people's lives, perhaps going hunting for sport, or entertaining guests with lavish feasts. Meanwhile, you'll be breaking your back in their fields, dreaming of a meal that consists of more than root vegetables and false hope. But here's what's truly remarkable about this whole situation. You're not alone in this misery. Every peasant family in the village is facing the same challenges, the same impossible choices, the same grinding poverty. And somehow, despite everything working against you, communities formed. People helped each other when they could. They shared what little they had during the worst times. They celebrated together during the rare good moments. They told stories around fires to pass the long winter nights. They fell in love, raised children, and found meaning in lives that were, by any objective measure, incredibly difficult. Your neighbour, old Willem, limps past your door on his way to the fields. His leg was crushed by a cartwheel 3 summers ago, and it never healed properly because medieval medicine was basically just hoping really hard and maybe rubbing some herbs on things. But Willem still shows up every day, still does his share of the work, still manages to crack jokes that make the day a little more bearable. His resilience is both inspiring and heartbreaking. Young Mary from 2 houses down waves as she carries a bucket to the well. She's 14 and already married with a baby on the way. Her husband died of fever last spring, which means she's now trying to manage everything on her own while pregnant. The other village women help when they can, sharing food and advice and labour, because that's how people survived. Not through individual heroism, but through collective stubbornness in the face of seemingly impossible odds. As you gather your tools for the day's work, you catch a glimpse of Brother Thomas making his rounds. He's one of the few people in the village who can read, and he serves as both spiritual guide and practical advisor. The church may demand its tithe and impose its fasting periods, but Brother Thomas also brings news from the outside world, helps settle disputes, and provides what medical knowledge exists. He's a reminder that even in this harsh world, there were people trying to make things better, trying to ease suffering where they could. The sun climbs higher, and you know you can't delay any longer. The walk to the Lord's fields takes about half an hour, and tardiness isn't tolerated. As you set off down the muddy path that serves as a road, you pass the village's various craftspeople beginning their own days. The blacksmith's forge is already glowing, sending sparks into the morning air as he works on tools and horseshoes. The miller is checking his water wheel, preparing for another day of grinding grain into flour. The baker is kneading dough for the bread that most people can't afford to buy regularly. Each of these skilled workers occupies a slightly higher position in the social hierarchy than you do, but they're still bound by the same feudal system, still subject to the same lord's authority, still struggling to make ends meet in their own ways. The blacksmith might eat better than you do, but he's also responsible for maintaining all the farm tools and weapons for the entire village. The miller controls access to ground grain, but he's constantly dealing with equipment that breaks down and seasonal variations in water flow that can shut down his operation for weeks at a time. As you walk, you pass the small stone church that dominates the village centre. It's by far the most impressive building around. which makes sense since the church is one of the most powerful institutions in medieval society. The bell tower rises above everything else, a constant reminder of the spiritual authority that governs so much of daily life. Sunday services aren't optional, and the church calendar dictates when you can work, when you must fast, when you can get married, and pretty much everything else of importance. But the church also serves practical functions that extend beyond the spiritual realm. It's where community announcements are made, where disputes are sometimes settled, where the few books in the village are kept. The priest might be the only person for miles who has any formal education, making him a valuable resource for legal advice, letter writing, and interpreting the complex web of obligations that govern feudal life. Today, though, your relationship with the church is complicated by the fact that it's a Friday during Lent, which means no meat. Not that you were planning on meat anyway, since you can't afford it, but the restriction feels particularly cruel when you're already struggling to find enough calories to sustain the physical labor ahead of you. The church's dietary restrictions might be intended as spiritual discipline, but for someone in your position, they often feel like additional hardship piled on top of an already difficult existence. You arrive at the edge of the Lord's fields just as the sun fully clears the horizon. The grain stretches out before you in golden waves that would be beautiful if they didn't represent hours of backbreaking labor ahead. Other peasants are gathering, tools in hand, faces already resigned to the day's work. The overseer, a man whose primary qualification seems to be his ability to shout loudly and find fault with everything, begins assigning tasks and reminding everyone of the penalties for slacking off. The work itself is exactly as miserable as you expected. The sickle feels heavy in your hands. The sun beats down mercilessly, and your back begins protesting within the first hour. The grain is thick and requires considerable effort to cut cleanly, and you have to bend over for each stroke, creating a rhythm of cut, straighten, move, bend, cut again that you'll repeat thousands of times before the day is over. But here's something interesting that happens during this mind-numbing labor. Conversations develop. Quiet discussions about village gossip, concerns about the coming winter, speculation about what's happening in the wider world beyond your immediate experience. These conversations are how information spreads, how community bonds are maintained, how people cope with the isolation and hardship of medieval rural life. Old Henrik, working the row next to you, mentions that his cousin in the next village overheard from a travelling merchant that there's been some kind of conflict between the king and his nobles. This news is both fascinating and completely irrelevant to your daily existence. Kings and nobles might fight each other, make peace, die, get replaced by their relatives, but your life remains essentially the same. Wake up, work, eat whatever you can find, sleep, repeat. But these fragments of news from the outside world serve an important psychological function. They remind you that there's a larger world beyond your village, beyond your immediate struggles. They provide topics for conversation and speculation that break up the monotony of physical labor. They create a sense of connection to events and people far beyond your direct experience. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher over the muddy village lanes, and you realize with growing dread that your workday has barely begun. Your stomach churns with hunger from that pathetic excuse for breakfast, but there's no time to dwell on it. The bailiff is already shouting orders, his voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. You're expected in the fields, and tardiness isn't just frowned upon, it's punishable. You grab your wooden hoe, its handle worn smooth by countless calloused hands before yours, and trudge toward the Lord's domain. The tool feels heavier today, or maybe it's just that your arms are weaker from months of poor nutrition. Either way, you have no choice but to shoulder the burden and begin another day of backbreaking labor that will leave you exhausted, aching, and barely alive. Medieval peasant work wasn't just difficult, It was systematically designed to crush the human spirit. You weren't working for yourself, mind you. 3 days a week, sometimes more, you labored on your lord's land for free. This was called corvée labor, and it was as mandatory as breathing. The remaining days, you could tend to your own meager plot, assuming you had the strength left to do so. Picture yourself bent over in the fields from sunrise to sunset, your back screaming in agony as you plant seeds that will mostly feed someone else's family. The plough you're pushing is little more than a sharpened stick attached to a wooden frame. No fancy machinery here, just you, your failing body, and the unforgiving earth that seems determined to resist every effort you make. Your Lord lives in luxury while you starve. He feasts on roasted meats and fine wines while you gnaw on mouldy bread. His children learn to read and write while yours work alongside you in the fields, their childhood, sacrificed to the endless hunger for labor. The injustice burns in your chest like acid, but there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Some days, you're assigned to work the Lord's gardens, tending to vegetables and herbs that will grace his table while you go without. You'll spend hours carefully nurturing delicate plants, knowing that a single tomato from this garden could feed your family for a day, but also knowing that taking even a leaf would result in severe punishment. Other days, you're sent to the Lord's vineyards, crushing grapes that will become wine you'll never taste. Your feet, stained purple with juice, will ache for days afterward. The irony isn't lost on you. You're literally treading the grapes that will become the drink your betters will toast their good fortune with. The worst assignments are in the Lord's stables. Mucking out horse stalls means wading through knee-deep manure. The stench so overwhelming it makes your eyes water and your stomach heave. But these horses live better than you do. They're fed regularly, sheltered from the elements, and cared for when they're sick. After all, a good war horse is worth more than a dozen peasants. When harvest time arrives, the pace becomes truly inhuman. You're expected to work from before dawn until well after dark, racing against time and weather to bring in the crops. Your Lord takes his share first, typically a third to half of everything you've grown. What's left has to last your family through the entire winter. The pressure is enormous. A poor harvest doesn't just mean less food. It means watching your children slowly starve over the coming months. You've seen it happen to your neighbours, the hollow-eyed desperation of parents who can't feed their young, the small graves that appear in the churchyard with increasing frequency as winter deepens. But even in good years, your Lord's demands seem to grow. New taxes, additional labour requirements, extra fees for using the mill or the oven. It's as if the system is designed to keep you perpetually on the edge of disaster, never quite comfortable enough to think about anything beyond basic survival. The social humiliation is constant. When your Lord rides through the village on his magnificent horse, you're expected to stop whatever you're doing and bow deeply. To make eye contact is considered insolent. To speak without being spoken to first could earn you a beating. You're reminded daily that you're property, not a person. Your wife faces her own set of degradations. She might be summoned to work in the Lord's household, cleaning his chambers, preparing his food, or caring for his children while her own go unattended. The Lord's right to your family's labour extends to every member, regardless of age or condition. Even your children aren't safe from exploitation. As soon as they're old enough to hold a tool, they're put to work. 8-year-olds tend geese. 10-year-olds help with the harvest. 12-year-olds are considered full labourers. Their education consists of learning to endure hardship and follow orders without question. The church, which you might hope would offer some protection or comfort, instead adds its own burdens. You're expected to give a tithe, 10% of your already meagre income, to support priests who live far better than you ever will. Religious festivals, while providing brief respites from labour, often require additional donations you can't afford. And through it all, you're told this is God's will, that your suffering in this life will be rewarded in the next. That questioning the social order is not just rebellious, but sinful. The very institution that should provide comfort instead reinforces your oppression, making resistance not just dangerous, but morally wrong. As the day wears on and your energy flags, you realize this is your life. Not a temporary hardship to endure, but your permanent condition. Your father lived this way, your grandfather before him, and unless something extraordinary happens, your sons will follow the same path. The system isn't broken. From your Lord's perspective, it's working exactly as intended. The sun finally begins to set, casting long shadows across the fields you've labored in all day. Your back aches, your hands are raw, and you're so tired you can barely stand. But there's still work to be done at home. Animals to tend, repairs to make, preparations for tomorrow's labour. As you trudge back toward your hovel, you pass the Lord's manor house, its windows glowing warmly with candlelight. You can smell roasting meat and fresh bread, can hear laughter and music drifting from within. For a moment you allow yourself to imagine what it would be like to live without want, to have enough food, to sleep in a real bed, to wake up each morning without the crushing weight of endless toil ahead of you. But such thoughts are dangerous. Hope is a luxury you can't afford. Better to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on making it through another day, on the small mercy that you're still alive while so many others have fallen along the way. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more back-breaking labour, more humiliation, more grinding poverty. And the day after that, and the day after that, until either death or old age finally releases you from this earthly bondage. Feudal burdens, the weight of obligation. In the dim light of dawn, as the first roosters crow across the countryside, Aldrich the miller awakens not to freedom, but to a web of obligations that bind him tighter than any iron chain. His bones ache from yesterday's labour, but there is no respite. Today, like every day, he owes his time, his sweat, and his very life to forces beyond his control. This is the reality of feudal burden, a system where every breath taken by a peasant serves the interests of others. From the moment Aldrich opens his eyes until he collapses in exhaustion, his day belongs not to himself, but to his Lord, his church, and a hierarchy that sees him as little more than a tool to be used until broken. The feudal system was built on a simple principle. Those at the bottom exist to serve those at the top. Every peasant, every serf, every common labourer was bound by invisible chains of obligation that determined not just how they worked, but how they lived, loved, and died. These weren't just economic arrangements. They were spiritual prisons that trapped entire generations in cycles of servitude. Consider the crushing weight of feudal dues. Aldrich owes his lord not just rent for his small plot of land, but a portion of everything he produces. His grain, his livestock, his vegetables, even the eggs from his chickens must be divided. The lord takes the first and largest share, leaving Aldrich's family to survive on what remains. But the obligations don't end there. 3 days each week, Aldrich must abandon his own fields to work the Lord's domain land. While his crops wither from neglect, he ploughs, plants, and harvests for a master who has never known hunger. These corvée labour requirements, known as boon work, could be extended during crucial seasons. When the Lord's grain needed harvesting, Aldrich might find himself working 6 days a week for free, watching his own harvest rot in the fields. The church, supposedly a source of spiritual comfort, added its own crushing weight to the peasant's burden. Tithes demanded 1/10 of all production, but in practice, the church often claimed much more. Special collections for building repairs, feast day offerings, and fees for every sacrament drained what little remained in peasant purses. A baptism, a wedding, even a funeral required payment to priests who lived in comfort while their flocks starved. Marriage itself became another form of bondage. When Aldrich's daughter came of age, she could not marry without the Lord's permission. The merchant, or marriage tax, often cost more than a year's savings. If she married outside the manor, the family faced additional fines for losing a worker. Love was a luxury the feudal system could not afford to permit. Even death offered no escape from obligation. When a peasant died, the lord claimed the best animal as a heriot, supposedly in exchange for the use of land during the peasant's lifetime. Families already devastated by loss found themselves stripped of their most valuable possessions, often the ox or cow, that meant the difference between survival and starvation. The forest, which might have provided game to supplement meagre diets, was forbidden territory. Strict forest laws reserved hunting for the nobility, turning poaching into a capital crime. A peasant caught taking a rabbit to feed his starving children faced hanging, while lords feasted on venison and boar. Even gathering fallen wood for fuel required permission and payment. Judicial obligations added another layer of suffering. Peasants were required to attend manor courts, losing precious working time to witness legal proceedings that usually favoured the wealthy. They paid fines for infractions as minor as allowing a pig to wander into the lord's garden or failing to maintain a section of road. Justice was not blind. It was purchased by those with the deepest purses. The grinding nature of these obligations wore down both body and spirit. Aldrich's wife, Emma, rises before dawn to tend their small vegetable garden, knowing that the choicest produce must go to the manor house. She milks their cow in darkness, setting aside the cream for the Lord's table, while her own children drink thin, watery milk. Her hands are cracked and bleeding from constant work, but she cannot rest. There are always more obligations to fulfill. Their son, barely 10 years old, already shows the bent posture of someone who has carried heavy loads too young. He should be learning to read, to think, to dream of a better future. Instead, he spends his days gathering stones from fields, herding animals, and learning that his life's purpose is to serve others. The feudal system deliberately crushed potential, ensuring that peasant children grew up to be peasant adults, never questioning their place in the hierarchy. The psychological weight of constant obligation was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Peasants lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing when new demands might be placed upon them. A lord's whim could double their work requirements. A poor harvest could lead to impossible tax burdens. A conflict between nobles could see their fields trampled by armies they had no stake in supporting. Religious teachings reinforced this mental bondage. Priests preached that earthly suffering was God's will, that questioning the social order was sinful, that patient endurance would be rewarded in heaven. The very people who might have offered spiritual comfort instead became enforcers of the system that oppressed them. The church taught peasants to be grateful for their suffering, to see their exploitation as a test of faith. Yet even within this system of crushing obligation, the human spirit found ways to resist. Peasants developed elaborate systems of mutual aid, helping each other meet impossible demands. They shared resources, labor, and knowledge, creating informal networks of support that the feudal system couldn't entirely destroy. They told stories of better times and better places, keeping alive dreams that the system tried to kill. Some found small acts of defiance. A miller might keep back a bit more grain than allowed. A farmer might let his best cow accidentally graze in forbidden pastures. These tiny rebellions couldn't change the system, but they preserved dignity in the face of dehumanizing oppression. The tragedy of feudal burden was not just its material effects, but its assault on human potential. How many brilliant minds were lost to endless drudgery? How many artists, inventors, and leaders never emerged because they spent their lives fulfilling obligations to others? The feudal system was not just economically inefficient, it was a massive waste of human talent and creativity. As autumn approached and harvest time arrived, the full weight of feudal obligation became most apparent. Aldrich watched as cart after cart of grain left his fields, bound for the lord's granaries. His family's winter survival depended on what little remained after all obligations were met. The irony was cruel. Those who produced the food were often the hungriest, while those who contributed nothing to its production feasted in abundance. The feudal burden was more than a historical curiosity. It was a system that deliberately concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few, while reducing the many to mere instruments of production. It created a world where human worth was measured not by character, intelligence, or contribution, but by accident of birth and inherited privilege. Even as seasons changed and years passed, the weight of obligation never lifted. Each generation of peasants found themselves bound by the same chains that had held their parents and grandparents. The feudal system was designed to perpetuate itself, creating conditions where escape was nearly impossible and resistance seemed futile. Yet the system carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The very burdens that seemed so permanent and unchangeable would eventually become so heavy that they could no longer be borne. When that breaking point came, the careful structure of feudal obligation would crumble, swept away by forces it had itself created through centuries of oppression and exploitation. For now, though, Aldrich closes his eyes as another day of obligation ends, knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same. By now, you've witnessed the grinding physical labor, the constant hunger, the ever-present threat of disease and violence. But perhaps the most crushing aspect of peasant life in feudal Europe wasn't the immediate suffering. It was the complete absence of hope for anything better. The feudal system wasn't just an economic arrangement. It was a cage built from law, tradition, and divine mandate, designed to keep peasants exactly where they were born, at the bottom. Imagine waking up each morning knowing with absolute certainty that your life would be identical to your father's and his father's before him. That your children would inherit not just your debts and obligations, but your very status as property tied to the land. This wasn't mere poverty. This was systematic, generational bondage disguised as natural order. The legal framework that governed peasant life was a masterpiece of oppression. Under feudal law, serfs couldn't leave their lord's estate without permission. They couldn't marry without consent. They couldn't sell their meager possessions or even keep the full fruits of their labor. Every aspect of their existence required approval from someone who viewed them as barely human. When a peasant died, their family faced the heriot, a death tax that typically claimed their best animal or most valuable possession. This wasn't just taxation. It was a system designed to prevent any accumulation of wealth across generations. Just as a family might begin to build something resembling security, death would strip it away, ensuring they remained perpetually dependent. The church, which preached salvation and divine love, was often the harshest landlord of all. Monastery estates were notorious for their rigid enforcement of obligations. Peasants owed not just labor and crops, but tithes, offerings, and fees for every sacrament. Want your child baptized? Pay the priest. Need last rites for a dying parent? Another fee. The very institution that promised spiritual freedom became another chain binding them to destitution. Marriage, that most basic human connection, was commodified and controlled. A serf couldn't marry someone from another manor without paying a fine called merchant to their lord. Young women were particularly vulnerable. Their marriages were often arranged not for love or compatibility, but to satisfy complex webs of obligation and economic necessity. Romance was a luxury the peasantry couldn't afford. Even their few moments of supposed freedom were illusions. Village fairs and market days, which might seem like brief escapes from drudgery, were carefully regulated spaces where lords collected taxes on every transaction. The alehouses where peasants sought momentary relief from their troubles were owned by the manor, ensuring that even their attempts to drown their sorrows put coins in their master's pocket. Education, that potential ladder out of ignorance and bondage, was systematically denied. The church controlled literacy, and while they occasionally trained promising boys for the priesthood, this only removed them from their families and communities, offering individual escape while leaving the system intact. Knowledge was power, and power was not meant for peasant hands. Perhaps most insidiously, the feudal system convinced many peasants that their suffering was not only inevitable, but righteous. The church taught that earthly hardship was the price of original sin, and that questioning one's station was tantamount to rebelling against God himself. The poor were told they were blessed, that their suffering made them holy, that their reward awaited them in heaven, conveniently in a place no one could verify. This psychological manipulation was reinforced by carefully crafted ceremonies and rituals. When a new lord inherited an estate, peasants were required to participate in elaborate ceremonies of submission, kneeling and swearing oaths of loyalty to someone who would work them to death without a second thought. These rituals weren't mere formalities. They were public demonstrations of powerlessness, designed to break spirits as surely as heavy labour broke bodies. The rare peasant who showed signs of intelligence or ambition faced a cruel choice: accept their fate or risk everything in a system designed to crush resistance. Those who spoke too freely might find themselves accused of heresy or sedition. Those who worked too efficiently might have their obligations increased rather than their conditions improved. Success, even modest success, was dangerous because it threatened the fundamental assumption that peasants were incapable of better. And yet, even within this suffocating system, human dignity found ways to assert itself. Peasants developed elaborate folk traditions that celebrated cleverness, triumphing over authority. Their songs and stories were filled with trickster figures who outwitted lords and priests, offering vicarious satisfaction in a world where direct resistance meant death. These weren't just entertainments, they were acts of psychological survival. Village communities, despite the pressures designed to pit them against each other, often developed strong bonds of mutual aid. When harvest failed, neighbours shared their meagre stores. When illness struck, the community rallied around the afflicted. When lords demanded excessive labour, villages sometimes engaged in subtle forms of collective resistance, working slowly, misunderstanding orders, or simply making the master's life difficult in countless small ways. Women, doubly oppressed by both feudal and patriarchal structures, nevertheless found spaces for agency and influence. The village wise woman who knew herbs and healing commanded respect that transcended formal hierarchy. The alewife who controlled the tavern wielded informal but real power over community gathering spaces. The mother who managed a peasant household often made decisions that determined her family's survival or demise. Children, even in this harsh world, were sources of joy and hope. Parents who had nothing else to give their offspring could still offer love, stories, and the hard-won wisdom of survival. Teaching a child to read the weather, to judge the mood of the Lord's bailiff, or to find edible plants in the forest was an act of both practical education and defiant hope. The seasonal rhythms that governed peasant life, while often brutal, also provided structure and meaning. The harvest festivals, even when most of the crop went to the Lord, were still moments of genuine community celebration. The winter storytelling sessions, huddled around inadequate fires, kept alive traditions and memories that connected peasants to something larger than their immediate suffering. Some found solace in mystical religious experiences that bypassed the official church hierarchy. Personal visions, ecstatic prayers, and folk versions of Christian doctrine offered spiritual sustenance that didn't depend on priestly approval or institutional validation. These underground spiritual movements were constantly suppressed, but they kept emerging, testament to the human need for transcendence, even in the most degraded circumstances. The feudal system's greatest weakness was also its defining characteristic. It was utterly dependent on peasant labor. Lords might own the land, but they couldn't work it themselves. This created a strange dynamic where the most powerless people in society were also the most essential. Occasionally, this fundamental contradiction led to moments of genuine leverage. When the Black Death decimated the population in the 14th century, surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in demand. Labor shortages meant they could demand better wages, improved conditions, even the right to move between employers. For a brief, shining moment, market forces worked in their favor. The response from the ruling class was swift and vicious. Laws were passed freezing wages and binding peasants more tightly to the land. But the precedent had been set. The system could be challenged. These glimpses of possibility, rare as they were, kept alive the dangerous idea that things could be different. In taverns and fields, around hearth fires and at market stalls, peasants whispered stories of places where men were free, where hard work brought reward, where children could rise above their parents' station. Most of these stories were fantasies, but fantasy can be a form of resistance when reality offers no hope. The feudal system lasted for centuries, not because it was efficient or just, but because it was comprehensive. It controlled not just labor and resources, but imagination itself. The greatest tragedy of medieval peasant life wasn't the hunger or the backbreaking work or even the early death. It was the systematic suppression of human potential on a massive scale. Millions of people lived and died without ever having the chance to discover what they might have become. How many potential scientists died in the fields? How many artists never held a brush? How many leaders spent their lives in submission? The feudal system didn't just exploit peasant bodies, it murdered peasant dreams. And yet, somehow, those dreams survived. In the folk tales passed down through generations, in the small acts of kindness between neighbours, in the fierce love of parents for children they knew would inherit their suffering, the human spirit refused to be completely crushed. The peasants of medieval Europe may have lived in chains, but they never stopped being human. This, perhaps, is their greatest legacy. Not just the crops they grew or the labour they provided, but the proof that human dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The dawn breaks grey and cold over the feudal countryside, and with it comes another day of unrelenting toil for the peasant masses. But today, we turn our attention to perhaps the most crushing aspect of their existence, the complete absence of any hope for betterment. In our modern world, we speak often of social mobility, of climbing ladders, of the possibility that hard work might elevate one's station. For the medieval peasant, such concepts were not merely foreign, they were inconceivable. Picture, if you will, a young peasant boy named Thomas, born in the year 1287 to a family of serfs bound to Lord Edmund's manor. From the moment Thomas draws his first breath, his entire future is predetermined with the cold certainty of winter frost. He will work the same strips of land his father worked, and his father before him. He will live in the same cramped, draughty hovel. He will eat the same monotonous gruel of barley and turnips. He will bow to the same lord, pay the same crushing taxes, and when his time comes, he will die in the same village where he was born, having travelled no further than the nearest market town. This was not pessimism. This was the iron law of feudal society. The very notion that a peasant might rise above his station was not just unlikely, it was considered a violation of the natural order, a disruption of God's own design for the world. The feudal system operated on the principle of rigid hierarchy, a great chain of being that stretched from the lowliest serf to the king himself. Each person had their appointed place, their designated role, and to aspire beyond it was seen as both foolish and sinful. The church reinforced this message from every pulpit. Your suffering in this life was part of God's plan, and your reward would come only in the next world, provided you accepted your earthly station with proper humility. Consider the crushing weight of this psychological prison. A peasant might possess natural intelligence that could rival any scholar, artistic talents that could create beauty to last centuries, or leadership qualities that could inspire nations. Yet all of this potential would be smothered beneath the daily grind of survival, buried under the weight of social expectations that demanded nothing more than silent obedience. Thomas learns to read the weather and the soil with an expertise that would impress modern agricultural scientists. He develops an intuitive understanding of crop rotation that won't be formally studied for centuries. He creates small innovations in tool design that increase efficiency. But none of this matters. His insights die with him, unrecorded and unremembered, because peasants are not expected to think, only to labour. The legal system itself ensured this stagnation. Serfs were bound to their lord's land not by choice but by law. They could not leave without permission, which was rarely granted. They could not marry without their lord's consent. They could not learn to read or write without explicit approval. Their children belonged to the manor as surely as the livestock, destined to repeat the exact same cycle of servitude. Even those rare peasants who managed to accumulate small savings found their hopes crushed by the system's design. Any surplus wealth could be seized by their lord at will. Special taxes could be levied without warning or justification. A bad harvest, a sick animal, a broken tool. Any of these could plunge a family back into desperate poverty, erasing years of careful accumulation in a single season. The guild system in towns offered no refuge either. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their trades, passing them down only to their sons or carefully chosen apprentices. A peasant's child could not simply decide to become a blacksmith or a carpenter. These professions were hereditary privileges, as closed to outsiders as the nobility itself. But perhaps most crushing of all was the way this system poisoned the very concept of ambition. When improvement is impossible, when effort yields no reward beyond mere survival, the human spirit begins to accept limitation as natural law. Peasants learned not to dream because dreams only brought pain. They learned not to hope because hope was a luxury they could not afford. The stories they told their children were not of heroes rising from humble origins, but of acceptance and endurance. The songs they sang were not of triumph over adversity, but of finding small moments of joy within unchanging circumstances. Their entire culture adapted to reinforce the message that this was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked, how it would always work. Thomas grows to manhood knowing with absolute certainty that his son will face the exact same limitations, the same crushing routine, the same absence of choice. There is no university to attend, no fortune to seek, no new world to explore. There is only the eternal cycle of planting and harvest, of birth and death, played out on the same narrow stage where his ancestors performed their parts. This psychological imprisonment was perhaps more devastating than any physical hardship. Hunger ends with a meal, cold ends with warmth, but the death of possibility, that wound never heals. It passes from generation to generation like a hereditary disease, each new birth bringing not hope for the future, but resignation to an unchanging fate. The feudal lords understood this dynamic perfectly. They maintained their power not just through force, but through the careful cultivation of hopelessness among their subjects. A peasant who believes change is impossible will never attempt rebellion. A serf who accepts his station as divinely ordained will police his own thoughts, censoring dangerous ideas before they can take root. And so Thomas lives his entire life within a radius of perhaps 20 miles, seeing the same faces, walking the same paths, performing the same tasks as his father and grandfather before him. When he dies, worn out by decades of backbreaking labour, he leaves behind only more peasants to continue the cycle. His individual humanity, his unique perspective, his unrealised potential, all of it disappears without a trace, as if he had never existed at all. This was the true horror of feudal life. Not just the physical suffering, but the spiritual stagnation, the systematic destruction of human possibility. In our time, we measure progress in generations, expecting each to surpass the last. For medieval peasants, progress was not just absent, it was literally unthinkable. They lived and died in the same narrow confines, their horizons never expanding, their dreams never reaching beyond the most basic necessities of survival. The feudal system was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a machine for converting human potential into agricultural output, grinding down countless individual lives to feed the leisure and luxury of a tiny elite. The brutal truth about peasant life in medieval Europe. Part 8. When bodies became battlegrounds. The winter wind howled through the gaps in Elred's hut, carrying with it the acrid stench of unwashed bodies and festering wounds. At 23, he was already an old man by peasant standards. His spine curved like a question mark from years of bending over furrows. His hands were gnarled claws, more bone than flesh, and his teeth, what remained of them, sat loose in bleeding gums like weathered fence posts ready to topple. This was the medieval peasant's body, not a temple, but a battlefield where survival fought a losing war against relentless decay. When we imagine medieval life, we might picture hardy folk working the land with simple contentment. The reality was far more grotesque. The human body, deprived of proper nutrition, adequate rest, and basic medical care, became a canvas of suffering painted in shades of infection, deformity, and premature death. Consider the peasants' daily uniform of agony. They developed a dark humour about their conditions, celebrated small moments of relief, and supported each other through the worst of their sufferings. This was the brutal reality of the peasants' physical existence, bodies worn down by endless labour, ravaged by disease, and tormented by pain that had no cure. Their flesh bore witness to a system that valued human life only for its labour potential, that ground down bodies as efficiently as it ground grain into flour. In understanding their physical suffering, we begin to grasp the true horror of peasant life in medieval Europe. Not just the poverty or oppression, but the constant, inescapable agony that filled every waking moment of their brief, brutal lives. The medieval peasant's body was not just suffering in isolation, it was trapped within a web of violence, both systemic and sudden, that could shatter their already fragile existence without warning. The landscape of medieval Europe was vast and unforgiving, stretching from the windswept moors of Scotland to the sun-baked plains of Iberia. But for those born into the lowest rung of society, geography mattered little. Whether tilling fields in Normandy or tending sheep in Castile, the peasant's lot remained brutally consistent. A life of endless toil beneath the iron fist of feudalism. Picture, if you will, a typical serf awakening before dawn in his cramped hovel. The walls, built of mud and wattle, leak both rain and bitter winter winds. There are no windows, only a small opening that serves to let in what little light the day might offer. The floor is nothing more than packed earth, shared with chickens, a goat, and whatever vermin have made themselves at home. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the acrid smoke from a fire that never quite draws properly through the crude chimney. Our peasant rises not when he chooses, but when the church bells toll. announcing another day of labor for his lord. He owns nothing, not the land he works, not the tools in his hands, not even his own body. He is property, bound to the soil as surely as the stones in the field. Should he attempt to flee, the punishment would be swift and merciless. The stocks, the whip, or worse, awaited those who dared challenge the natural order. But the physical bondage was only the beginning of his misery. The medieval peasant lived under a crushing web of obligations that ensured he would never rise above subsistence. To his lord, he owed labour, typically 3 days each week working the domain lands for free. The remaining days, he could tend his own small plot, but even this came with conditions. A portion of everything he grew belonged to the Lord. Another portion went to the church as tithe. What remained was barely enough to keep his family from starvation. Consider the case of William the Smith, a fictional but typical peasant from a manor in Yorkshire during the 13th century. William worked a small strip of land, perhaps 2 acres, that had been in his family for generations. Not because they owned it, but because they were bound to it like cattle to a barn. Each week, William owed his lord 3 days of labour. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he would trudge to the Lord's fields before sunrise and work until sunset, ploughing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting as the season demanded. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday were his own, theoretically, but during planting and harvest seasons, the Lord could demand additional labour. Boon work, they called it, though there was nothing voluntary about it. If William refused, his family would be thrown off their land and left to starve as vagabonds. So he complied, watching his own crops wither while he tended his master's grain. The tools William used were primitive and inadequate. His plough was little more than a sharpened stick that barely scratched the surface of the heavy clay soil. His sickle was dull, his hoe crude. When these implements broke, as they frequently did, William had to repair them himself or do without. The Lord provided nothing but land and the promise of protection, a promise that often proved worthless when raiders came calling. Even in death, the peasant could not escape his lord's demands. When William's father died, the family owed a heriot, their best ox, to the lord as a death tax. When his daughter married, they paid a merchet, essentially purchasing permission for her to leave the manor. Every transaction, every life event, came with a fee that kept the peasant family perpetually impoverished. The seasons brought their own particular torments. Spring meant back-breaking work, preparing the fields, often while still weak from winter's meagre rations. The peasant would guide his ox through the heavy soil, fighting to cut furrows straight enough to please the Lord's bailiff. His bare feet would be caked with mud and manure, his hands cracked and bleeding from the rough plough handle. Summer brought endless days of weeding under a merciless sun. There were no breaks for the heat, no shade to rest in. The peasant bent over his crops from dawn to dusk, pulling weeds that seemed to grow faster than his grain. His back ached constantly, his skin burned and peeled, but still he worked. The alternative was starvation. Autumn was harvest time, theoretically a season of plenty, but in reality the most stressful period of the year. Everything depended on bringing in the crops before the weather turned. The entire village worked together, men, women, and children, labouring frantically to cut the grain with their sickles, bind it into sheaves, and cart it to the Lord's granary. The peasant watched as cart after cart of grain, grown with his sweat and blood, disappeared into storage he would never access. When the harvest was counted, the Lord took his share first. Then the church claimed its tithe. What remained was divided among the peasant families, and it was never enough. A good harvest might see them through to spring. A poor one meant watching children slowly starve through the winter months. Winter was the cruelest season of all. With no work in the frozen fields, the peasant had no way to earn additional food. His family huddled in their hovel, burning whatever they could find for warmth: dung, straw, scraps of wood. The cold was so intense that water froze solid in their crude bowls. Chilblains and frostbite were common, and many lost fingers or toes to the cold. Food became an obsession during these dark months. The peasant family would carefully ration their meagre stores, eating thin gruel made from whatever grain they had managed to hide from the Lord's collectors. They would gnaw on bones until they splintered, desperate for any nutrition. Children cried constantly from hunger, their parents helpless to provide more than empty promises that spring would come again. But even if they survived the winter, spring brought no real relief. Weak from months of near starvation, the peasant had to find the strength to begin the cycle anew. Ploughing the fields with muscles wasted by hunger, sowing seed when every grain looked like a potential meal, all while knowing that most of what he grew would never reach his own table. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. The peasant lived without hope of advancement, without dreams of a better life for his children. The rigid social hierarchy was not just an economic system, but a religious doctrine. The church taught that God had ordained the three estates: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. To challenge this order was not merely rebellion, but heresy, punishable in this life and the next. The peasant was told that his suffering was noble, that through toil and submission he might earn salvation. But salvation seemed a distant and abstract concept when faced with the immediate reality of hungry children and an empty hearth. Some found comfort in religion, attending Mass in the drafty village church and finding community in shared faith. Others grew bitter and resentful, though they dared not voice such feelings openly. Violence was an ever-present threat in the peasant's world, not just the violence of war, when knights rode across his fields, trampling crops and burning villages, but the everyday violence of a system built on coercion. The Lord's bailiff carried a rod and was quick to use it on peasants who shirked their duties or showed insufficient respect. The village reeve, himself a peasant, but one elevated to oversee his fellows, had to choose between betraying his neighbours and facing his lord's wrath. Justice, such as it was, favoured the powerful. When a peasant was accused of a crime, he faced a system designed to extract confessions through torture or trial by ordeal. He might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar or plunge his hand into boiling water. If the resulting wounds healed cleanly, a medical impossibility, he was declared innocent. More often, infection set in, proving his guilt and sealing his fate. The peasant woman faced additional burdens beyond those shared with her husband. She bore children knowing that many would not survive their first year. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In some regions, nearly half of all children died before age 5. Those who survived faced a childhood of labour and hardship. There was no schooling for peasant children, no time for play or learning. As soon as they could walk, they were put to work tending animals, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. Marriage for peasant women was rarely about love or choice. It was an economic arrangement, often decided by the lord who controlled both parties. A peasant woman needed permission to marry, and that permission came with a fee her family could ill afford. Once married, she was subject not only to her husband's authority, but to the sexual predation of the lord and his men. The droit du seigneur, the lord's supposed right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night, may have been more myth than practice, but the threat of sexual violence was constant and real. Pregnancy offered no respite from labour. Peasant women worked in the fields until they went into labour, then returned to work within days of giving birth. They had no access to medical care, no understanding of hygiene or nutrition. Childbirth was a lottery with death, and many women died in agony, leaving behind orphaned children and grieving husbands. Even in their hovels, peasant women found no peace. Domestic violence was not only tolerated, but expected. A husband was considered weak if he did not discipline his wife with his fists. The church reinforced this hierarchy, teaching that women were inherently sinful and needed masculine control. A peasant woman who spoke too freely or showed too much independence might find herself accused of witchcraft, a charge that could lead to torture and execution. The daily routine of medieval peasant life was mind-numbing in its repetition. Rise before dawn, work until exhaustion, sleep fitfully, and repeat. There were no books to read, no entertainment beyond the occasional travelling minstrel or religious festival. The peasant lived in a world of crushing monotony, where every day was a struggle for mere survival. Food was not nourishment, but desperation. The peasant diet consisted primarily of bread made from coarse grains, thin porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small garden plots. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days, and even then it was likely to be the tough, stringy flesh of an animal too old or sick to work. Milk, eggs, and cheese, when available, were more often sold to pay taxes than consumed by the family that produced them. The bread that formed the staple of the peasant diet was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Water was frequently polluted with human and animal waste, leading to constant diarrhea and disease. Malnutrition was universal among the peasantry, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and shortened lifespans. Disease stalked the medieval peasant like a hungry wolf. Plague, typhus, dysentery, and countless other ailments swept through villages with terrifying regularity. The Black Death of the 14th century killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, but it was only the most dramatic of many epidemics that decimated peasant communities. With no understanding of contagion and no effective treatments, disease was seen as divine punishment or demonic influence. The peasants' housing offered little protection from disease or the elements. Most lived in one-room hovels with dirt floors, thatched roofs, and walls that leaked in every storm. Families of 6 or 8 people shared this space with their animals, creating perfect conditions for the spread of disease and parasites. Privacy was unknown, hygiene impossible, and comfort unimaginable. Sanitation was primitive beyond modern comprehension. Human waste was dumped in open pits or simply thrown into the streets. Garbage rotted where it fell. Vermin swarmed through every dwelling, carrying disease and devouring what little food the peasants could store. The smell alone would have been overwhelming to modern sensibilities, but the medieval peasant had no choice but to endure it. Education was not just unavailable to peasants, it was actively discouraged. Literacy was seen as dangerous, potentially giving the lower classes ideas above their station. The rare peasant who learned to read and write did so in secret, knowing that discovery could bring punishment. Knowledge was power, and power was reserved for the nobility and clergy. The church, while preaching charity and compassion, was often the peasant's harshest oppressor. Tithes were collected ruthlessly, even in years of famine. The local priest, supposedly a man of God, lived far better than his parishioners while demanding ever more donations and fees. Church lands were worked by peasant labour, but provided no benefit to those who toiled on them. Religious festivals offered brief respites from the grinding routine of peasant life, but even these were tainted by the underlying reality of oppression. Christmas might bring a slightly better meal and a day of rest, but it also brought demands for special offerings to the church. Easter celebrated resurrection and renewal, but for the peasant, each year brought only more of the same suffering. The legal system was another instrument of oppression. Peasants had few rights and little recourse against abuse. They could not testify against nobles in court, could not bear arms in their own defence, and were subject to arbitrary punishment for the slightest perceived offence. The law existed to protect property, and since peasants were property themselves, they had no standing to invoke its protection. Technology that might have eased the peasants' burden was either unavailable or forbidden. Innovations that could increase agricultural productivity were often suppressed if they threatened to upset the social order. The peasant was expected to work with the same primitive tools his ancestors had used, ensuring that his productivity remained low and his dependence on the Lord absolute. Even religion, which might have provided psychological comfort, was twisted into another form of control. The peasant was taught that his suffering was God's will, that rebellion was sin, and that his only hope lay in patient endurance of whatever hardships his betters chose to inflict. The promise of heavenly reward was used to justify earthly oppression, creating a system where the victim was made complicit in his own exploitation. Weather was another enemy the peasant could not fight. A late frost could destroy an entire crop, condemning a family to starvation. Too much rain rotted grain in the fields, while drought withered it before it could mature. The peasant had no insurance, no savings, no safety net beyond the grudging charity of the church or the calculated mercy of his Lord. Natural disasters struck with terrifying frequency and devastating effect. Floods swept away entire villages. Earthquakes toppled the crude structures peasants called home, and fires raced through thatched roof settlements, destroying everything in their path. The peasant who lost his home to such disasters had no claim on assistance, no right to rebuilding materials, no guarantee that he would not simply be cast out to die. The isolation of peasant life was perhaps its most psychologically damaging aspect. Most peasants never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace. They had no contact with the wider world, no understanding of different ways of life, no hope that things could be better elsewhere. Their universe was bounded by the Lord's manor, and within those boundaries they were trapped, as surely as if they wore chains. War brought its own special horrors to peasant life. When armies clashed, it was peasant fields that became battlegrounds, peasant homes that were burned, peasant women who were raped, and peasant men who were slaughtered or impressed into service. The peasant had no voice in the conflicts that devastated his world, no say in the political disputes that cost him everything. He was simply collateral damage in the games of his betters. The few peasants who attempted to resist or escape faced brutal punishment. Runaway serfs were hunted down like criminals and returned to face their lord's wrath. Those who participated in peasant revolts were tortured and executed as examples to others. The system was designed to crush any spark of independence or hope, to ensure that the peasant remained docile and obedient no matter how unbearable his circumstances became. And yet, somehow, the human spirit endured. In the darkest moments, peasants found ways to help each other, to share what little they had, to maintain bonds of family and community that transcended their individual suffering. They told stories, sang songs, and passed down traditions that preserved some measure of dignity and humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Children played when they could, lovers found moments of tenderness, and communities came together in times of crisis. These small acts of resistance and humanity were perhaps the only victories available to medieval peasants. But they were victories nonetheless. They proved that even the most oppressive system could not entirely crush the human capacity for love, hope, and mutual aid. The legacy of medieval peasant life extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The suffering and struggle of these forgotten millions laid the foundation for all subsequent progress in human rights and social justice. Their patient endurance under impossible conditions demonstrated both the depths of human degradation and the heights of human resilience. Peasants lived with the knowledge that their next meal was never guaranteed, that their children might not survive the coming winter, that years of back-breaking labour could be wiped out by forces entirely beyond their control. This bred a particular kind of fatalism, a grim acceptance that suffering was not an aberration, but the natural state of existence for people of their station. The social hierarchy that dominated medieval Europe ensured that when disaster struck, the burden fell most heavily on those least equipped to bear it. While noble granaries might hold enough grain to weather several bad harvests, peasant families often had stores sufficient for only a few months. When crops failed, the wealthy could purchase food at inflated prices, but the poor could only watch as their meagre savings evaporated and hunger settled over their households like a shroud. Religious institutions, despite their vast landholdings and accumulated wealth, offered only limited relief. Monasteries might distribute bread to the starving, but these charitable acts, while genuinely compassionate, were drops of water in an ocean of need. The Church's response to famine often emphasized spiritual rather than material remedies, encouraging the suffering to view their hunger as a form of divine testing or penance for humanity's sins. The long-term effects of chronic malnutrition shaped every aspect of peasant society. Children who survived famines often bore the physical and mental scars for life, their growth stunted, their cognitive development impaired. Women faced the particular horror of trying to nourish infants while their own bodies wasted away from lack of food. The elderly and infirm, viewed as burdens during times of plenty, became expendable during famines, quietly disappearing as families made impossible choices about who would receive the last scraps of food. Yet perhaps most tragically, these cycles of famine and recovery created a cruel illusion of progress. When good harvests returned, when granaries filled once more, when children's laughter replaced the silence of hunger, it seemed as though the nightmare had ended permanently. But those who had lived through famines knew better. They understood that abundance was temporary, that the spectre of starvation was merely sleeping, not dead. This knowledge coloured every moment of plenty with anxiety, every celebration with the shadow of future suffering. The agricultural techniques of the medieval period, while sophisticated for their time, remained fundamentally vulnerable to the whims of weather and climate. The three-field system, crop rotation, and selective breeding of livestock represented genuine advances in farming knowledge, but they could not overcome the basic reality that food production depended entirely on forces beyond human control. A single volcanic eruption in distant Iceland could alter weather patterns across Europe, turning fertile regions into zones of death and desperation. Trade networks, though gradually expanding throughout the medieval period, remained too primitive and unreliable to effectively redistribute food from areas of surplus to regions of scarcity. When famine struck northern France, grain from southern Italy might as well have been on another planet. The costs of transportation, the dangers of long-distance travel, and the simple lack of infrastructure meant that regional famines could persist even when food was available elsewhere. The psychological and social mechanisms that allowed peasant communities to survive these repeated catastrophes reveal both the remarkable resilience of human nature and the profound costs of such resilience. Families developed complex strategies for rationing food during lean times, with elaborate hierarchies determining who ate first and who went without. Communities created informal networks of mutual support, sharing resources and information about where food might be found. These survival strategies, born of desperate necessity, became deeply embedded cultural practices that shaped medieval society for generations. As we reflect on these devastating cycles of famine and survival, we begin to understand how deeply the threat of starvation penetrated every aspect of peasant consciousness. It influenced marriage decisions, as families calculated whether they could afford to feed additional mouths. It shaped religious beliefs, as people sought divine explanations for seemingly random catastrophes. It determined migration patterns, as desperate populations abandoned their ancestral homes in search of regions where food might be more plentiful. The scars left by medieval famines extended far beyond their immediate victims. They created cultural memories that persisted for centuries, influencing art, literature, and folklore in ways that continued to resonate long after the specific events had passed into history. The image of death as a skeletal figure with a scythe, reaping human lives like wheat in a field, emerged directly from these experiences of mass starvation and became one of the most enduring symbols in Western culture. Understanding these cycles of catastrophic hunger helps us grasp why medieval peasants displayed such profound attachment to religious faith, despite the apparent absence of divine intervention in their suffering. When earthly existence offered so little hope, when human effort seemed so futile against the forces of nature and social oppression, the promise of eventual reward in an afterlife became not merely comforting, but psychologically essential for survival. The legacy of medieval famine extends beyond historical curiosity into fundamental questions about human society and our relationship with the natural world. These catastrophes revealed both the fragility of human civilization and the extraordinary capacity of people to endure unimaginable suffering while maintaining their essential humanity. In the darkest moments of the Great Famine, when social bonds seemed to dissolve entirely, there remained individuals who chose to share their last crust of bread with strangers, who risked their own survival to help others, who maintained their dignity and compassion even as the world crumbled around them. This complex legacy of suffering and resilience, of catastrophe and survival, formed the foundation upon which later European society would build. The innovations in agriculture, the development of trade networks, the gradual emergence of more effective governance structures, all of these advances emerged partly as responses to the devastating vulnerabilities revealed by medieval famines. The peasants who survived these catastrophes, who learned to endure the unendurable, who passed their hard-won wisdom to subsequent generations, created the human foundation upon which our modern world ultimately rests. Their suffering was not meaningless, though it was certainly not deserved. In learning to survive the unsurvivable, in maintaining their humanity through the most dehumanizing circumstances, they demonstrated capacities for endurance and adaptation that would prove essential for humanity's long journey toward greater prosperity and security. The morning broke grey and cheerless over the village, much like every other morning for the past several years. But today felt different somehow, heavier, as if the very air itself carried the weight of accumulated suffering. You rise from your straw mattress feeling the familiar ache in your bones, the same ache that has become as much a part of you as your own heartbeat. Your joints protest with every movement, grinding like millstones worn smooth by endless use. The thin gruel awaiting you for breakfast tastes of nothing but desperation and water. Your family huddles around the meager fire, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, each lost in their own private struggle against the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The children have stopped asking for more food. They've learned, as all peasant children must, that want and scarcity are the natural order of things. Outside, the fields stretch endlessly under a leaden sky, demanding your labor once again. Your hands, cracked and bleeding from yesterday's work, grip the wooden handle of your hoe with the resignation of someone who has long since abandoned hope for anything better. The earth is hard and unforgiving, much like the Lord who owns it, much like the world that has shaped you into this bent and weary creature you've become. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of your existence isn't the hunger, or the backbreaking labor, or even the constant threat of death from disease or accident. No, the cruelest thing is how thoroughly the system has convinced you that this is simply how things are meant to be. The church tells you that suffering in this life ensures salvation in the next. The nobles remind you that God has placed everyone in their proper station. The very structure of society reinforces day after day that peasants are born to serve, to suffer, and to die in obscurity. You've been taught that to question this order is to question God himself, that to desire more than your meagre lot is the sin of pride, that to resist the will of your betters is to invite not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. And so you submit, not just your body to the endless cycle of labor, but your very soul to a system designed to extract every ounce of value from your life, while giving nothing meaningful in return. The psychological toll of this existence weighs heavier than any physical burden. You watch your children grow stunted and weak, knowing they face the same bleak future that has consumed your own life. You see your wife age prematurely, her beauty faded by malnutrition and despair, her spirit gradually crushed under the weight of watching her family suffer while being powerless to change their circumstances. And yet, somehow, impossibly, you endure. Not because you're particularly strong or brave or noble, but because the alternative is death. And even this half-life is preferable to no life at all. You endure because humans have an almost supernatural capacity to adapt to even the most horrific circumstances, to find small moments of meaning in the midst of overwhelming suffering. Perhaps it's the brief smile your youngest child gives you when you return from the fields. Perhaps it's the way your wife's hand finds yours in the darkness of your hovel, offering wordless comfort in a world devoid of softness. Perhaps it's the singing that sometimes rises from the village on feast days, voices joining together in harmonies that seem to transcend, however briefly, the brutal reality of daily existence. These moments don't justify the system that creates such misery. They don't make the suffering acceptable or meaningful in any cosmic sense. But they do reveal something profound about human nature, something that even the most oppressive system cannot completely destroy. The capacity for love, for connection, for finding beauty in the smallest gestures of kindness. The feudal system you inhabit is designed to crush this spirit, to reduce human beings to mere tools for generating wealth and power for their betters. It succeeds largely in this goal. Most peasants live and die without ever realizing their full potential, without ever discovering what they might have become in a world that valued their humanity. The waste is staggering, immeasurable. How many potential artists, inventors, philosophers, leaders were ground down by the millstone of medieval society before they could bloom? This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the feudal age. Not just the immediate suffering it caused, but the profound loss of human potential it represented. Entire generations lived and died in circumstances that prevented them from becoming fully themselves, from contributing their unique gifts to the great human story. The system was so effective at maintaining itself that even its victims became complicit in perpetuating it, teaching their children to accept their fate, to keep their heads down, to never dream of anything better. And yet, even in this darkness, seeds of change were being planted, not through grand revolutions or noble declarations, but through the quiet persistence of people who refused to be completely broken, through the mother who secretly taught her daughter to read, through the craftsman who took pride in his work, despite receiving little recognition, through the storytellers who kept alive tales of justice and heroism, even when such concepts seemed impossibly distant from daily reality. The very fact that you survived, that your ancestors endured long enough to eventually create a better world, stands as testament to something indestructible in the human spirit. Not because suffering ennobles, or because hardship automatically creates virtue, but because even under the most crushing circumstances, people find ways to preserve their essential humanity. As the day wears on, and your body screams its familiar protests against the endless labor, you might catch a glimpse of something beyond the immediate horizon of your suffering. Not hope exactly, for hope has been beaten out of you long ago, but perhaps a recognition that this moment, this day, this life, is not the final word on human possibility. The world you inhabit seems permanent, unchangeable, ordained by forces beyond human control. But systems created by humans can be changed by humans, even if that change comes slowly, over generations, through the accumulated weight of countless small acts of resistance and resilience. Your story, the story of the medieval peasant, is not primarily one of heroism or triumph. It's the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they must to survive while maintaining whatever fragments of dignity and humanity they can preserve. It's a story that honors the struggles of those who came before us, who endured the unendurable, so that future generations might have the chance to build something better. The sun sets on another day of toil and suffering, but it also sets on another day survived, another small victory against a system designed to break the human spirit. And in the morning, despite everything, you will rise again, because that's what humans do. We endure, we persist, we survive. So there you have it, the complete breakdown of why peasant life was absolutely miserable in feudal Europe. From the backbreaking labour and constant hunger to the brutal social hierarchy and ever-present threat of disease, these weren't the good old days that some people romanticise. But here's what's really fascinating. Understanding how our medieval ancestors survived these impossible conditions actually reveals something incredible about human resilience. And if you want to dive even deeper into just how harsh medieval life really was, you need to watch this video right here, where I break down the horrifying reality of medieval medicine and why a simple toothache could literally kill you. Trust me, after watching that, you'll never complain about a dentist visit again. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.